you realize obviously everybody is discussing online learning. It's very, very hot topic right now, not only in UVA but everywhere else as well. But our main premise is that we just jump into it and we're not reflective about it, we're responding to a huge wave. So we should stop and be reflective about this. And the good thing is University of Virginia happens to have a lot of expertise in this area, so why don't we utilize this and step back and think about the founding stones of what online learning should be. So today's topic is online learning and space, and when I talk to people about this, they're always a bit surprised. Like, okay, what does that mean? Is there space in online learning? But our premise is that when you're building a school, you have to think about space, right? If you're building a physical learning environment, you have to build a space. So why aren't we thinking about space and how people interact with space when it's online? So this is going to be the focus of our conversation today. And the people here, I will have them introduce themselves. But first, Lindsay is the program manager of OpenGrounds. Could you tell us a little bit about what OpenGrounds is?
So thank you all for coming today. This is part of our series of open table discussions. So in addition to online learning, we have a variety of other open table conversations that will be taking place throughout the semester. So you can always check our website for more information on that. OpenGrounds is, and Bill Sherman, who's on our panel today, is the director, who can tell us a little bit more, but OpenGrounds is a space and a bigger idea than just this physical space about connecting people in new ways across boundaries. So whether those are departmental boundaries or boundaries between schools here at UVA, boundaries between UVA and the larger Charlottesville community, and boundaries between UVA and the larger outside world. So we're trying to create new ways for people to interact across those boundaries, from conversations like this to open hours in the space where people can be working, multiple groups working at different times, to partnerships with larger institutions and corporations, sponsoring challenges, and offering just different ways for students and faculty and community members to interact around interdisciplinary initiatives. So thank you all for coming today, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Our speakers today, I'll let them introduce themselves. Let's start with Bill Sherman. Just a few words about who you are, how awesome you are.
I'm a member of the faculty of the School of Architecture and a practicing architect, as well as in the Office of the Vice President for Research, working on projects like directing OpenGrounds. So I'll leave it at that for a moment.
Great. I'm Mabel Kinsey. I'm faculty at the Curry School of Education, where I teach instructional science and technology.
And we had the third person, Bill Furster, who also works at Curry School of Education and at Shanti. Bill apparently he had an appointment, a doctor's appointment. He's having eye surgery, and I asked him to be done by this time, but apparently doctors are unreliable, so he can't join us. But we will have Bill Furster join us for one of the other sessions. So I think he has a lot to add to this discussion. He has himself designed a lot of online tools for educational purposes, and he is a faculty at Curry School. So he will come back to be with us again. And I would like to hear from you too. I know there's huge expertise in here, especially about what we're talking about. So after we have our initial conversation, I'd like to turn back to you and ask you if you'd like to introduce yourselves. Now, the reason we picked these very important people is all three of them. Bill is not here, but I'll pretend he is here, and I'll say things that he would probably have said. We work together and collaborate a lot too. But the three people in here, they are designers in different capacities. Of course, Bill's design capacity is very obvious as an architect and as a person who's very involved with space. Mabel is an instructional designer, which I consider to be a very important design process. She is thinking about processes and interactions and making experiences for people who are learning and making sure that these experiences work really well. And Bill Furster is a designer in an online learning sense as well. He actually designs online tools, and he has designed several of them. So for this reason, space is very, very important. So one of the first questions I'd like to go with, and Bill, we could start with you if you'd like. As an architect, when somebody tells you online learning and space, what does that make you think about?
Okay. Can start, and I hope this becomes very much an interactive conversation. And just as an aside on designers, I can vouch for the fact that Mabel's a designer, because about a number of years ago I had the good fortune to design her house. But it was very much a collaboration, and Mabel and Richard are just as much designers as me and partners in working on that work. So it's great to have designers in many different capacities and roles here at the table.
And likewise, I can vouch for Bill's thoughtfulness and flexibility, as well as the incredible design sense, aesthetics, and engineering he brings to his practice. So he's great to work with, and it's a lovely house. You're all welcome to visit.
So there's a connection that runs deeper than this topic, but the discussion of online learning in space, and one of the things that I'm really intrigued about it, is that whenever there is a kind of a change in the way that we think about the institutions, the technologies, the way that we interact in many different dimensions of life and in many different institutions, there is a corresponding change in the kind of space that we create for that to happen. We're living in one of the great experiments of that from the early 19th century. We can actually think about how, whether it's global forces or simple technological changes that maybe not so simple, but they change the way that we interact with each other. There's at first a kind of adaptation that goes on of people kind of working with that technology and adapting it to spaces that they have. Over time, as people start to realize the potential, and this happens in architecture in every dimension of the work that we do in architecture, over time, there's a kind of adaptation that goes on where we start thinking about and designing spaces in new ways, recognizing that those fundamental changes in the interaction that we've encountered and that we've begun to explore set up new possibilities for interacting. As a very short aside, just to indicate something that's going on in real time right now, UVA has just started offering all of these courses on Coursera, and 1 week after they started, we got a request from a group of alumni, people from the community of Charlottesville, and students to ask whether they could come and use this space to form study groups, to have a study group in the evening working on that course together. I wasn't expecting that, and what we realized is that there is actually, and started reflecting on what that request kind of meant. We said yes, of course. We always say yes, which gets us into trouble sometimes, but we said yes, and so there's now a group here meeting. But we realized that there is that the kind of online learning environment, as opposed to the traditional classroom that is very much about a kind of a face-to-face encounter, puts a kind of demand for interaction, for direct human interaction, that the computer, our interaction with the computer, our interaction of sort of working through, following the lectures, responding, doing the problem sets, is in a way is on a certain level insufficient. There's a kind of study that I would love to see as these MOOCs start taking off and online learning goes much further, is how the kind of dropout rate corresponds to people who try to do it in isolation versus people who do it together. So there's a dimension of this that has to do with putting another kind of demand in real demand in space. I was talking to Jim Cohen, who's on our psychology faculty, about this connection between our desire for sociability and the way our brain works and human space. And we were talking about it's really interesting that the sort of coffee shop culture in the US developed precisely in coordination with the rise of the internet. And we start thinking about what that meant in terms of a kind of public culture, for instance, that we didn't have, that led to a kind of space of informal interaction that complemented the kind of human to computer interaction that could have just as easily been taking place in the privacy of people's own home, but it actually, these kinds of interactions on one level can be isolating, but on another level can trigger a kind of desire to share, or can trigger a kind of desire to engage in that interaction in public. And we see kind of evidence of this in the changing nature of public life. These kinds of processes have been going on throughout human history, where there's a new way of interacting that triggers the emergence of a different kind of institution or a different kind of space. So that's one dimension, is that And let's think about it in terms of the university, the discussions of flipping the classroom, of online learning as being a different set of, is creating a different set of possibilities for the university. The spaces that make up the university are really reflective of a particular model of education. There's been a number of discussions at Darden about the fixed seat classrooms and whether the kind of space that the iLab created at Darden is actually far more reflective of where an education and interactive model is going. Not strictly related to online, but that as a changing idea about what constitutes the education leads to a demand for a different kind of space. It's certainly something Jefferson was interested in as he was moving away from either the monastic model of the university or the barracks model of the university, which was how he described William and Mary, and was characteristic of a lot of other schools at the time, to this kind of open-endedness, but it related to a kind of curricular idea and a model of a way that people might interact with each other. So we can get into what we might speculate about where this is going, but we're right at the cusp of a whole new exploration of the literal physical spaces where this learning will take place. And it's actually very likely to be spaces that have the kind of flexibility and interactivity that, for instance, this space is characteristic of than necessarily the traditional fixed-seat classroom, which is the prior model for that delivery of education. And it raises a really interesting challenge for institutions as they rethink their kind of future growth and development and change the assumptions about the kind of space. That's just one dimension of this, but it's, and there's others that I think we'll get to later that talk about virtual space as well.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And one of the main things in here is the human interaction, because that is what space is really important for. And you said a great thing. We always imagined that it could bring isolation, but the web has turned out to be something quite different. It actually has created interactions and encounters, maybe much more than it would have happened before. But at this point, I'd like to turn to Mabel and ask, as an educator,
Right.
So human interaction online versus offline. When you're thinking about designing for online, what are the challenges? This all sounds great and very optimistic, but does it really work out that way?
Well, one of the things, in fact, I've been focusing on for the past year and a half, along with Janair and Bill Furster, who's not with us today, is tool evolution. So rather than imagining that we're going to take what we do at UVA and get it online and retain, in what some cases is a knowledge transmission model, and move more towards a knowledge creation model in the process. And rather than do what we do here as well, do it as well as we do it here online, what could we do better as we move online? What are the affordances of new technologies that might make it possible to be a lot more explicit and supportive of knowledge construction? So we know from research that information, knowledge passively acquired, say, strictly in a recipient model, remains inert for students in the face of problems to which that information is applicable if it's not learned actively in the course of solving problems that knowledge is created. That is the information, that is the knowledge that becomes very flexible and extensible. So what can we do in the online environment to help make that possible? And how can we make explicit the evolution of understandings? So one of the things that I've been working on with Janair and with Bill is a new discussion tool. Many of you have participated, no doubt, in online discussions, and they are typically threaded discussions, temporally arranged from the first post to the last post. And if you're an instructor, it's a lot of work to comb through all of them, to find the themes that go together, to comment on them in every place they appear, and to try and draw forth from that what are the understandings that are emerging from this discussion. Really hard to do. So we've begun designing a tool in which every post is its own atomic element, for lack of a better word. It remains its own object that we can then go into, identify the things that go together, pull them almost physically together, and comment on that. And then there can be a whole thread of discussion evolving from that. So we're working on that. Jenner is the key programmer for that. And he's very long-suffering because I'm all the time sending him a list of new requirements. But we think that this is an example of what we can do that will serve a larger number of students, geographically disparate from UVA, who can't quit their jobs and come here, especially for a graduate education, and make the online experience really rich. One other thing I think I want to say about it, while there are a variety of tools and affordances for shared document editing, for presentations, for providing resources to your students, they're in a variety of tools. I often send my students to 4 or 5 different tools in order to accomplish what I need to accomplish, and it's a mess. They hate it, they get lost, they're frustrated, they're mad that I haven't provided something better for them. They should be, you know. We need to be working towards something that's a cohesive whole, that's a seamless experience. When I used to design for desktop and for web, we used to say as a general guideline, every user should be able to get at what he or she wants within 2 clicks, 2 mouse clicks. Well, that's a pretty tall order. We might not be able to quite get at that, but I think that's worth aiming at, to bring everything together seamlessly into an environment and in such a way that in providing all the things they need at any point in time, it's not an ugly, crowded, confusing environment, that it's a welcoming space that feels good to spend time there, because Lord knows you will spend a lot of time there. So I think that's another challenge for us. We're starting to iterate on individual tool designs, but again, we have a collection of component parts that are flying in loose formation, approximating a whole.
That's actually, I always think about real school examples when you say that, because imagine, for instance, you went to a school and they told you, this book is in that building, you just go there. This tool, you just go walk down this hall, here are the directions, write it correctly. So go there and then find that there and let me know what you did. So, and this is online, just a click or two, but it is still cumbersome, and it is, in terms of envisioning space, it's not the unified, cohesive whole that we're thinking about. And Mabel is right, online has a lot of potential for this. I remember in the late 90s, hypertext was a big deal, because it was new. The fact that you could link somewhere else and just go to a completely different place in a reference point that you define was amazing for people, because like, oh, I don't have to read through the entire thing if you give me the link to which paragraph you want me to go to. So this was a revolutionary thing, and I know that my faculty in Germany, they were even doing studies on hypertextuality and text. So now it's very commonplace for us. We forget that we're actually going somewhere else. And with the discussion, as Mabel pointed out, when we talk, when is our talk of a line of things that will always remain with that same order? It's not. We take it, we work with it. In our minds, there are different connections that happen. But with online, when you have a threaded discussion, it's always the same order. It's a temporal order with who said to whom, and there's a spacing of it designed in that way. And we're trying to overcome that. It's like, okay, let's make people be able to do things, switch things around, move things over. Like whenever I'm playing with something, I feel like, okay, I see it, this box is in here, and I want to move that person to that box, like make him a friend or something else. I have to go to a complicated procedure. All I really want to do is like take that person and then put that person right there. So I want to bring this back to Bill as an architect. If somebody tells you we have to design a school, every building will be in a different place, and every building will be designed by somebody else.
That's what we're living. And each one is for a different function. And it's actually one of the great promises of the let me back up. One of the things that is exciting about the emergence of online learning is that it opens up a new chapter in the way that we organize knowledge. We can think about through periods of history, there have been different kind of structures of knowledge that, and the way that we think about the relationships of things. We can see the emergence of individual fields in the sciences at certain moments in history. We can that start to change. I actually just came out of a discussion with a student of landscape architecture. We were talking about the shift from a kind of hands-on agricultural knowledge as it shifted to a chemical knowledge at a molecular level that coincided with the invention of fertilizers in the 19th century, that set up a whole different way that we relate to the world when new fields of knowledge. And if the 20th century has been marked by the kind of compartmentalization of knowledge that's reflected in our campuses by every discipline and every school having a different building in a different place, that kind of division doesn't exist or have to. It doesn't exist a priori, and certainly doesn't have to exist in the virtual world that we may create. And so the traditional boundaries and this comes back to the problem solving, because most problems aren't solved. The kind of learning that you do in problem solving usually involves drawing on a whole range of areas of knowledge to put it together to make sense, rather than to memorize this set of chemical equations, because that is what you need to know to be able to solve this next chemical equation. This kind of knowledge sticks. So we're at a moment of a kind of explosion that comes from the fact that it's been described as a kind of a radical expansion of the human mind that happens when you're simultaneously living in two worlds. And when we're sitting, when somebody's in here, and we have some here sitting here at a computer in a space, your brain is processing two completely different realities simultaneously. And it's working in a very different way in that environment. And I love the way Mabel's describing the attention that needs to be paid to the kind of two clicks and how that works, but then connecting that to real space, and the real space, or the physical space. In some ways, both are just as real because they're both just constructions inside the mind. But the physical space, in a way, is going to radically alter how we engage that online world and the kind of preconceptions that we might bring to it. And they're going to push back on each other, and we're already seeing it emerging in the forms of new cities, new institutions, new experiments, and much more kind of hybrid places where you get mixtures of activity going on that in a sense are starting to be as complex as having multiple windows open on your screen as you move back and forth within a frame. So it's there's an old, very famous quote from Winston Churchill about we shape our buildings and then they shape us. In some ways, it doesn't just apply to buildings, but in a way, we're not necessarily even have that much authority about shaping our buildings. There's a whole set of cultural forces that are setting up a kind of precondition for shaping buildings, and this living in the dual world of the virtual world and the physical world is changing the way that we're perceiving both kinds of space. And so there's a huge opportunity that, again, we are only beginning to explore of how we think between those two simultaneously. And that two clicks applies just as much to physical space as it does to the virtual space in terms of whether something becomes meaningful in our lives or if it becomes a one-off destination that we go down and take care of and then come back from.
So this would be a great time to turn to the audience, and I'm sure as you're listening, it happens to me, some things come to your mind. Is there anything you would like to add, your online learning experiences and your frustrations with space? Or maybe somebody would like to challenge us and say, wait, it's not a big deal. We can do it. Before you talk, could you please say your name and anything you like about yourself?
Mabel, I wanted you to talk a little bit about more how you take this temporally ordered stuff and then reorder it, what, for other people, or, because I'm just thinking, I might not like your order, and then I'm thinking as a 20th century person, if it changes all the time, every time I go in there, where am I? I want to order it myself, but I don't know, it's just,
Right, so
it's just fluid for my own mind.
in its current instantiation, the threaded nature of the discussion remains, but there are a variety of views of the discussion. So you can view it according to what we're calling connections or syntheses, as well as the temporal arrangement. You can view it by who's contributed. You can view it by a timeline. So how did the conversation evolve over time? I'm not. My thinking around that hasn't evolved sufficiently. I don't quite know how best to use that evolution of thought. I just haven't had enough time to delve into it. But the standard viewpoint always remains and is not changed.
I think one of the main ideas we have is like when you go to that location or place, what do you want? What is your goal to get there? So if you just go there for a certain order of how things happened, like a historical timeline, we're all very used to it. This happened before that. So temporal order is important for you. Then you would like to maintain that kind of relationship. But what we have discovered is that we often go to that discussion space with different ideas in mind. I want to go and see if a person has done something. I only care about that person, so I want to see what that person has done. So I change the view and the display of it to show me what that person has been doing. And another way to do is that I want to talk about...
Oh, so just let me add something there. So those of you who are faculty, that's a really handy way of grading students' engagement in the enterprise, right? So you can see all of the things that they have contributed and what they contributed in response to, who built off of their work, and so on.
Yeah. So the idea is to reorganize it in that way. Yes.
I just want to jump in here. Of course, maybe you don't have to jump in here. My name is Mary Alpizet. I actually am #1 in line for your tool when it's ready to go. Because I teach courses right now with threaded discussions. I direct the statewide outreach program in reading. We do 22 courses a semester. Grade government are online. So we have struggled with this whole issue of discussions. It's a huge issue, both for the instructor and for the student. And the way we've handled it is through instructional design. Thank you, Mabel. She's trained the instructional designer that we work with. And so our courses actually have specific topics, maybe 3 or 4 in our forum. And we group the students in those topics. And it's interesting because obviously we're looking at a subject matter, so the topics are delicate to some extent. You end up reading something in topic 3 that should have been discussed in topic 1, or dovetails with topic 1, and then Ollie and I are working together on it, so we're trying to figure out how do we respond. And so we have to, it is our problem to make sense for the students to help them with a summary or a statement or whatever.
And do you need to respond everywhere it appears?
Well, no,
Which is what I've tried to do in the past, in the hours
We've
past.
gotten way past that, like, oh no. I jump in when if somebody's going off another way, I'll come in, or I really need a like button, like I need to like a Facebooker, so I need to be able to say I like your comment without having to say anything, but I can't do that. You might want to add.
We have that.
A like, good.
Yeah, we
But,
have-
yes, I need that very easily, just a push like. But I think that from the standpoint of what you said about creating knowledge rather than imparting knowledge, that's probably for students taking an online course, the hardest thing they have to get through is figuring out they've got to work a little harder than just sitting in the classroom and listening. They have to respond to get that weekly check mark, grade, whatever. And that's, I'd much rather, personally, I've taught for many years, I'd rather teach online face-to-face now, because I've really made that transition over to the whole issue of online, because I meet so many fabulous people. You're talking about space. I'm sorry I don't need to be in their space.
Mm.
I have someone in Albania, someone in Mali, I'm very worried about her right now, somebody in California. They're in my classes and they're sharing. I mean, you cannot get that sitting here. I'm sorry, they're not going to put their jobs in
Yeah,
either.
but that's one of the things that's exciting to me is that it doesn't need to be in your space, but there might start to be networks and connections of people in those places who are talking to each other. In a way, it's a little bit like the world of social messaging, where there's kind of one-to-one correspondence that we might do through texting. There's kind of one-to-many where we're sending, and we do the same thing with teaching. And then there's this kind of many-to-many that start to be a whole set of loose alliances and arrangements. And that's the space I'm interested in. Not that you have to reconstruct the classroom again, but it's this springing up.
It's
Yeah.
just fascinating.
We do have that to a certain degree because we have a cohort of teachers from Richmond here in our course, and then we have other people, a few from Roanoke, a few from OpenGrounds. So the ones from Richmond have been going through courses together face to face, and now they're coming into this as a group, and it's interesting because
Yep.
they already know each other, and they know where each other works and different things going on, and so they're able to contribute to each other and then to other people in a whole different way.
Which is so different than the traditional classroom, where it's the interaction is so, a really good seminar might work, but so much of the traditional classroom is a one-to-many kind of presentation, and this enables, by in a way removing the hierarchy of the teacher controlling the conversation, it allows this other conversation to take place, and that's the one that I'm exciting about, and that's the one I was trying to refer
It's
to.
very rich, and it also gives our students here who happen to be in this course, they've had their blinkers taken off. Like, oh my God, look what's happening out there in the schools. We're talking about literacy education. And the other point I wanted to make, Mabel, which is so true, is that we're not just giving information to people, we're allowing them to create it. So I've had the opportunity to work with a few faculty at our school at Curry who are hesitant about online, but are trying it, like they're putting their toes in, they're building a course, they're teaching it. One of them came to me the other day and she said, my God, this is the best thing I've done for this class. I've never been able to get this good. And I said, and now you don't have to do it again. Because it's there. You know what I mean? Now she's using it for her face-to-face class and her online class. So I just can't say enough about how the future, and I just think building the future for ourselves is so important. Anyway, I'm your
One-
friendly face up here saying, go for it.
One
Hit
input-
like button, which is, and I'm very glad for your test and your pilot program.
One important aspect which Bill's presence would have filled a little bit more, but I can do it a little bit for him, is more practical aspect of designing that experience. Because I think of spaces like there's a left and a right, there's a top and a bottom, there's a place you need to scroll down for, and then there's the top like the fall of the paper. So that is also a space, how you go from back and forth, how crowded it is, how well it's designed, how aesthetic it is, which one of our talks will come back to. But that kind of space is also a problem. Like collab is something we always complain about because its idea of space does not translate into anything that I feel very intuitive. So let's look at a little bit more practical aspect of it too. One thing I wanted to mention, for instance, I don't know if you can see it, but you have a projection in OpenGrounds in here. You realize it's going all the way down to the end of the wall, which I really like, but it's kind of interesting to me because projection, for instance, our idea of projection is this constricted 4x3 area. And this achieving it with several projectors, but it's saying to us, wait, our understanding of digital space can expand. It can be horizontal in this way, so you don't have to scroll all the time. You actually, this is all connected, by the way, so you can move things around and it's all one wall, and it's all very connected. So it's creating this horizontal depth as well. Whereas online interaction right now feels just like it's just a wall, and that's all that it is. It's nothing else. So one way people escape this, I think Bill could help out with this. People first wanted to make things 3D, like Second Life. Say, okay, I know how to solve this. I'll make the 3D version of the actual life. Is that your answer to our problems?
It's actually, it's interesting because the first of all, and what's really exciting about this ways of rethinking these threaded conversations is moving from a fixed linear presentation of information that we associate with the written page or with the printed page, and clearly the online space doesn't have that analogy, but when we look at so many of the ways that we interact, that model is still coming through, even in the the scrolls that come down, the vertical orientation of most web pages when almost all of our computers are horizontal. So there's one dimension that is, there's been this kind of, still this persistent linear mindset that is reflective of the construction of a linear narrative, even with the introduction of hyperlinks and other things. And that's where, when you're trying to overcome the linear chat or the linear comment page, by having other ways of reorganizing and moving through, it's really exciting because you realize that our way our brain works is actually to process things in a much more nonlinear way, or with this desire to search for or pull out information that's not fixed by a chronological time frame. The first efforts at 3D space were very much almost a step back 500 years to the invention of perspective in the Renaissance, as if that was the best way to understand the world. And it's a very old model of picturing the world. It's a very powerful model, and it still persists, and we can see that, and we can understand it, and all of a sudden it gives us all these other surfaces and all these other dimensions we can work with. But it's certainly not the limit, and we can see through the arts, we've seen a tremendous exploration of other ways of thinking about space, whether it's superposition and transparency and seeing through layers to layers behind. Again, and occasionally, there's, in Apple, sometimes they have these translucent menus that allow you to actually see through them and to work through. That's where that's coming from, is not a perspectival understanding of space, but a kind of organization of space according to principles of modern art composition, which has to do with implied and transparent layers that allow the brain to actually process and construct the space for itself. Again, we haven't really been exploring that kind of space on a very sophisticated way yet. It's been in a very simple way, of just a simple level of literal transparency. So again, there's territories for research and exploration about how the mind works and assembles information in ways that allow these, you might say, these nonlinear juxtapositions, or these leaps of seeing relationships that aren't necessarily intended or given to you in the same way that the written page gives you a kind of a fixed set of relationships. And that's why I'm really interested in when you're talking about these new search tools, they allow an interactivity that allows kind of simultaneous multiple views that allow you to see, if I'm understanding correctly where you're going with this, that allow you to see relationships that you wouldn't see otherwise if you were constrained by the fixed space.
How do you think there's a question, please.
I'm Claudia. I took Curry's first course in academic uses of the World Wide Web in '95 with John Lowy.
Oh, great.
I think I'm surprised that you all didn't mention the wonderful example of digital learning up at Monticello, at the center on the mountain in the history section, with all of the things bouncing around the walls and multiple viewings and whatever. I'm also surprised at this, that it doesn't rotate around the room, so that I could read what each one as it came by and pause, and not have to go all the way down to the end to see these others.
I'd have to take my Dramamine if that were happening.
So I'm fascinated by the topic, and where I'm focusing my work is looking at ancient models of learning that thrived in India under the Hindus and the Buddhist models of mandalic information, buried in colors and configurations of deities and so forth, which are learning tools. Probably the most remarkable one in modern times for me was a program that was started by Trumpo Rinpoche and a cohort named Norman Casper. We created a program called Space Awareness. It's now called the Maitri program at the Europa Institute. And there the emphasis was to read or somehow gauge the internal response, one's personal internal evolved response to space, whatever it would be, and then to categorize that in 5 different families so that each student would understand that when they come into a green rectangular room, square window, whatever, they're going to be they're unconsciously triggered to react to whatever happens in that room in a certain way. So I think in contemplating a project, it's come to UVA through that money. It's going to be well spent on helping education bridge the gap between inner architectures, outer architectures, and inner architectures, and best fit teacher to student, student to student group. Like grouping on astrology, like having all the Tauruses in one group, Geminis in another group.
And see if fights break out?
See how that would affect the learning of a standard. Those kinds of architectures.
So I would like to extend to Mabel again, like if you look at education research, this is not anything really new, immersive environments, authentic learning methods. So are we losing that online when we go online, all this extra information that maybe actually helps learning? Or is it just enough to have the content?
Well, I think we need to try to recreate some of that immersiveness, which is what I was alluding to earlier, to try and bring all of the experiences together. As I think about instructional design, there are 4 main functions that I as a designer try to incorporate in my learning experiences. That's exposure to new content. Usually it's in response to authentic problems, but it could be just a little bit more straightforward delivery. But development of new knowledge, being able to see applications of that knowledge, observe it, critique it, understand how it gets applied, to be able to do. So take that understanding of the new content and your observational understandings, make plans and engage in something, do it, experience what that is like, and then the final phase, which really brings all the previous to fruition, is reflection. So what did you find out? What does it mean? How can I do better? What are the takeaways from this experience that inform the bones of my practice moving forward? So I try to recreate that in person and online. I think each has its affordances. Our challenge, again, is to bring the online tools together into a same space that's seamless and accessible.
So if I told you, Mabel, then let's say I'm doing an online course and I said, this is great, I want to do all of this completely online. Would you think of something that would require you to say, well, no, you can't do all of it online for this specific thing? Like, can we actually come to a point where all of the learning that you mentioned here, including the do, can be done completely online? Or is it can we not rely on completely digital tools? That's an important question, because this is the difference between me as a university having a completely online course, or me as a university still clinging on to the physical space that I have for reasons that are not nostalgia, but they're also saying, like, listen, you have to be here to do this. In instructional design, is there something that would say, yes, for some things you would have to be here?
I think you could probably do it all online with the resources now available. My hesitation in responding in that way has to do with the affordances of the individual interacting with the multidimensional nature of the real world. I don't think yet that we have those layers of complexity. But to the extent that an individual needs to engage with others, I teach instructional designers, so they need to be able to analyze learning needs through interaction with other people in the social environment, analysis of the physical environment, study of the institutional environment in which the learning systems take place. I think a lot of that can be accessible online. Part of our challenge as designers and faculty is to help make that possible. Probably a good bit of it can take place online.
I think it's good news for a lot of people. We have a question?
I just want to piggyback on that and ask you what you each view, what your thoughts are on augmented reality in this business.
I think it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And so I have in the past taught educational game design, and we've designed augmented learning experiences, and I just think that's huge, and I can't wait for the goggles that superimpose the display over the natural environment and make possible really fast access to relevant information that helps us understand and more deeply process the environment in which we're transiting. So yeah, way cool.
I would say on the most fundamental level, that's what a university is. It's about creating an augmented reality. And so I'm really excited about the capacity to, in a way, what we've been doing for the last 500-600 years is compressing time. And what augmented reality is actually moves to simultaneity, where there's an engagement where you're not sort of learning in a classroom and then taking it out and applying it in the real world. You're actually getting this compression of new knowledge being engaged simultaneously with the experience of the world. Mm-hmm. And that kind of compression opens up a huge world of possibilities for the way that we learn and the way that we interact. On one level, I really agree about the, if we're thinking about individual sort of bodies of knowledge and contents of course and what we can do in terms of taking that body of material and moving it online and being able to do that really effectively online and not necessarily needing the face-to-face classroom. I completely agree with that. I would separate that from the function of a university because a university is much more complex than that. And so much of the knowledge and the experience and the value of a university is the connection between that kind of work that goes on in the classroom and the community that's built and shared. And also, I personally don't think that there's a lot of stuff raging in the press now about whether online learning is going to make universities obsolete. It's going to make them different, but there is still another value that has to do with the way that we build community, form relationships, and from the inherent complexity of understanding in real space that goes beyond an interaction in real space and social dimensions that cannot fully be mirrored in the online world. There's some really interesting studies about the quantity or the information content of human communication between talking face to face, talking say over the phone, and sending an email. And if you talk about all the different cues that we're interacting with using all of our senses, and there's a dimension of engagement that simply cannot happen online until we move to completely different kind of multisensory interactive environments than we have. That is a different question than the question about can we really deliver a body of course content online and get a deep understanding of this field that I'm trying to communicate, which I think we can do online very well.
Right, the kinesthetic experience cannot be at this moment recreated, and there are aspects to that encourage deep processing and understanding of the world. And there's something about us all being in this space that I can't put a name to that's vital and important and cannot at this moment be replicated. Yeah.
We can probably all still remember the smell of a physics lab from college, even if we don't remember what the conversation was about. I think you had one here that made me play.
I really appreciate the conversation about how do we take the technology and think about how we can make it a more meaningful interaction with what you're doing. I've seen your discussion boards with Phyllis share that with me. And people are frustrated with discussion boards as the first thing. And I was just curious about what are the student reactions, what are they asking for when they've seen your tools. I think it's nice and it's explicit, it's intuitive, and I think it does provide meaning and different views. I was just wondering what students were saying about that.
Well, you might be hearing more about that.
Yeah.
In that Jenner is the front line for issues, reactions, user testing.
You make a very good point. Some of the things they said we did implement back. They want things to be quick, faster, easy to find. So when they go in there, they don't want to scroll through things. And we made other design decisions that actually improved their experience a lot. So we did not have a word limit first, for instance. And then the thing is, then we put a word limit of 500 characters, which is one paragraph. And the interesting thing is that they said they liked it a lot better. And they actually read the whole discussion, which is interesting because I went back and compared the discussions. The amount of text did not change. So people posted little amounts, but they posted more. So if you went there, for you to read, the stuff you had to read was the same. Actually, in some cases, more. So it's not because you were lazy and now you're happy. So you read the same thing, but you for the first time read the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And what that made us think in terms of space, for instance, is that you look at it, there are small chunks. You think like, okay, I can do this. There's this small chunk. There's that. It's like Dan Brown books. Like you read a chapter, it's 2 pages. You're already done. So that actually made a huge difference in terms of usability. But I think, and we can argue about this, but the fact that how it looked in terms of space, that it did not take a huge chunk of space, helped them actually do the same amount of work that they did, and maybe do more work. So these kind of things.
I think the thinking that was expressed was better.
Yeah.
It had to be sharpened. You had to make your point.
Mm-hmm. Which is what design is about. And when I say you have to design online learning experiences, what I mean is that you don't take a bulk of text, a 3-page thing you had in a Word document, copy paste it to a website. Mm-hmm. Because they're different mediums.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that you're working really hard on that.
Well, we'll keep you posted about the development of that project. But it generally reflects like how are you designing something, how much space should it take. Another thing like show hide, for instance, online. Some people really like it, some people really hate it. When they go somewhere, they want to see everything that is available to them, whereas other people want to say like, no, I want to be able to hide things out of my view. I don't want to see them anymore. Another huge discussion in terms of radial menus. You click on a menu and something else pops up. You click on it, a third level pops up. Some people really don't like it. They're like, okay, I want to know all the menus available to me when I first go there. But some other people say like, I want to contextually think about this. Mm-hmm. So these are the kind of challenges that are very related to the idea of space. Mm-hmm. Because first we have to understand that this is a space. Let's start with that. This is a space we need to design. And that's how it relates to architectural terms too.
When you're doing your work, I assume you're not looking for the answer because some people like it one way and some people like it the other way. And I hope you can provide both or all three or all hardly, options of ways of learning and thinking.
So programmers always want to do it their way. But
it's actually, we went through a lot of these discussions with our graphic designer as we were working out the OpenGrounds website. And if you go to our website, which I think is up over here, you notice the pages are horizontal. They fall on one page. You then can make a choice and move to other pages through it, but you don't scroll. It's not about scrolling. That's a very concrete spatial decision. There are about 3 or 4 different ways to navigate through it because people have different preferences. You can go down the left menu, you can find ways across and things in it. And so accounting for those differences, accounting for the ways different people work, but also to be very conscious and to not just let it be a kind of default decision about how space is organized because that's the way you've always seen it and that's the way you've always done it. We actually got a lot of flack when we did it horizontally because everybody thought there was something missing off their page and they had to scroll. We added little buttons for when people were looking at it this way or if they had a small screen, and it's actually designed in 2 parts to fit on iPads as well as other kinds of monitors. It's you have to understand the space that you're operating in. It's a particular context, and there's a kind of temporal context as well in terms of how you're going to be navigating through and why you're moving through it. So it's a wonderfully complex problem. It's as rich as the design of any building.
It's funny that you should mention that because one day I saw it some one way, and then another day I saw it some other way. I said, wait, I know they had all 4 of them listed here. Where are they? So I guess I was thinking, some century way in the morning and some other century in the afternoon.
You might have hit it just when we actually made an update or an adjustment too, which is possible. Because websites are also like gardens, at least they should be. They're constantly being tended. And
we have another question over here.
Not a question so much more for curiosity. I'm Roy Cooper. I did my doctorate at Curry, and I'm now a professor at the University of North teaching, I really consider myself a designer of learning experiences. And because it's often the business world, it's not so much about content, it's about leadership. And sort of Bill, some comments you made earlier on the design side sort of invited me to start thinking about, as I think about trying to create more collaborative learning experiences for my students, because they're all practicing managers and executives and organizations, what's on the horizon that enables them and their small groups to be more collaborative, which is truly what they want. And maybe I was thinking about your tool and my students and asking them currently how they collaborate, and they do three things at the same time. They're on a conference call, they're emailing one another, and they're trying to do things on Blackboard, which just kind of defeats the purposes. So I'm curious on the design side, what are some challenges and questions I can add to these groups as they're prototyping and researching that'll help encourage them to think more about space in new ways?
I'd sort of answer that just to be really concrete in two ways. That number one is, in terms of space, everything's going to have wheels on it. Just to be really concrete, it took us about 3,000 years to put wheels on luggage. Now we're finally putting it on chairs, tables, and everything else. And so that is an immediate kind of tool for collaboration. I know architecture firms where everything's on wheels, so when they get a new project and they're assembling a team, everybody just rolls their desks over and they roll whatever resources they need over, and they form a cluster where they can work together. And a lot of the kind of places where collaboration spaces, classrooms are being explored is where we've reached the end of the fixed furniture. That's just a really concrete example about that. The other, in terms of what you're starting to talk about, prototyping and a whole, there's a book by Tim Brown, who founded IDEO, that you probably know, Change by Design, that is actually one of the best and clearest explorations about the design process and thinking in terms of both collaborative work but also cycles of testing ideas that are very much about the what you were describing as the discovery of the knowledge through applying and solving problems and how you work through that. And the way he describes it in there is just as applicable to online space or virtual space as it is to physical space. But it has very much to do with this cycling through of testing things in the real world and then moving back through and using that knowledge to improve and move forward. And in the process, be discovering what knowledge you need, as opposed to being, say, this is the knowledge you have, apply it. This is the problem I'm facing. What do I need to go learn to figure that out? What expertise do I need to bring in? And that's the way designers work. IDEO is a design firm that covers many different dimensions of design, but they become famous by developing a kind of methodology that is now turned into the curriculum of the design school at Stanford. But it is very much about this iterative cycling process that is probably one of the clearest, in terms of one text, exploring that'd be really clear.
So we're running out of time almost, but I'd like to ask if anybody, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question or made your comment, if anybody would like to go. Okay.
I'll make one comment. I think this would be a radically different comment or conversation if it was a table full of the millennial students that are
Yeah, absolutely.
right now.
Absolutely.
It's interesting. We'll try to, next time we do it, we're testing it right now. We will broadcast the broadcast link for people who can't be here to see if the space limitation we have somehow can be lifted, so we can have different kinds of participations in that sense. Although I wouldn't be very quick to say it would be drastically different, but if they were here, we would be able to see. That would have been very nice.
Well, I might just add to that last comment. I'm sure, Mabel, you've encountered this, that I've been working with students doing parts of my course online, parts, and the change even in just the last 5 years in terms of the experience of this generation of students that we have is so fundamentally different than it was 5 years ago in just it's in some ways, the classroom is the alien space, the standard classroom is the alien space, the virtual environment is the familiar home. And that's a complete flip from even just working with these technologies 5 years ago. And it's, and that in itself is going to be as much a driver of change as anything that we think up and come up with.
Just in a final point, I'd like to quickly comment on. A number of you have mentioned multitasking, particularly for millennials. And a number of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, there were conversations around prohibiting online chats during lectures. I heard at one of the schools at the university, they turned off the wireless network so that students would attend to what was happening, what was being delivered by the instructor or guest speakers or whatever. And so I started thinking about this, and I said, what if instead of regimenting it and saying you cannot do these other things, we posed tasks for students that would be instructionally relevant, so they weren't just chatting about miscellaneous topics. They were charged with critiquing the lecture and coming up with applications of the principles and practices in their own line of work. And then we analyzed the discussion transcripts and found that yes, they were able to multitask, but they hated it. So I think that since it was 5-6 years ago, these weren't quite the millennials yet, and so maybe our competencies are evolving in that regard. And also we might think about sequential tasking rather than multitasking. I don't know, I'm an old person now, so I know that I cannot listen to Bill and Jennair at the same time and give either of them quality attention. But I could listen to Bill, have a thought, turn to Jennair, convey that thought, turn my attention back to Bill. So as an instructional designer, I'm thinking about sequential experiences that are interactive of multiple sources. And thinking maybe that's a supportive line of inquiry, rather than trying to do all things at once.
That's great. So this has been a great conversation. And they were touched on some of the issues, and I just want to remind you, this is the first one in a series of 4. The next one, the next event we have will be on art and aesthetics of online learning. And after that, we'll talk about community building in online learning. And our last one from faculty from engineering school will talk about specifically doing engineering education in online learning. So I hope you stay in the loop. We will make sure you get the news. And before we leave, thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to thank our speakers again for joining us.